Welcome to Data Driven Leaders, a podcast for business and technology leaders who are trying to shape and influence the future of data and analytics. In each episode, we feature conversations with data-driven leaders who are at the forefront of using data to solve complex business challenges. Let's jump in now and uncover some of the biggest challenges today's data-driven leaders face and find out what it really takes to build a data-driven culture.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Data Driven Leaders. I'm your host, Christina O'Reilly, and this episode is brought to you by Gen Squared, a service provider dedicated to solving complex data and analytics challenges for today's enterprise. In our previous podcast, we've been talking a lot about the insurmountable amount of data that is being generated. Best estimates today are suggesting that at least 2.5 quintillion bytes of data is produced every day. So for those of you like myself, don't know how big quintillion is, just add 18 zeros to the end of that. To me, that's completely staggering. And it begs to ask, what does the future hold? According to IDC, they predict by 2025, we will have generated 175 zettabytes. And a zettabyte is a trillion gigabytes. And then multiply that 175 times. So no wonder organizations are frozen under the volume of data, right? And it's not going to stop anytime soon. It's only going to grow as the world continues to evolve and change. So businesses really need to figure out, how they're going to unlock their data and quickly. So where do they start? What are some of the approaches to unlocking that value? Well, my guest today believes it starts with asking your why. Organizations need to come together and figure out their why around their data. Joining me today is David Lloyd, the Chief Data Officer at Ceridian. Welcome, David.
Welcome. Yeah, it's great to be here, Christina. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. So your journey to Ceridian is a bit of a unique background, right? You've got both a very strong technology background, but equally a strong business leadership background. So I'm curious to know what led you to Ceridian and to a role that's relatively new in comparison to the C-suite, like a CIO, and one that's still being defined and shaped today.
Happy to talk about that. It's less of a random walk than sometimes it may seem. Yeah, I definitely started off, I'm a bit of a mutt, so I have the whole technology side, and then it's funny, I was talking about this the other day with some people, and they said, what caused you to go off and do your MBA of all things? And I recognized I really wanted to have the business side as well. And it actually came from a comment a VC made that if you want to run companies, we want you to have a really strong finance background. So took that to heart and went off and did my graduate degree in business to add to that. But the funny thing is that my whole career has been shaped by data since probably some of the earliest days, dealing with large volumes of it in the early 90s in what would be very early search, and then how that just expanded throughout my career, working in a major law firm, for example. The volume of unstructured data that we dealt with was incredible. And, as we kind of make our way through all this, most of the companies I've helped build and the companies I've been part of, like Ceridian, over the last 15 to 20 years have all had a data centricity to them. So I think that's, to me, it's fairly normal. I would say actually I'm a data hack from a long time ago, and some of the best people I knew were really strong in that area. I think for Ceridian, what it was there's this really fundamental understanding that the type of data they have, which is very rich and it's very encompassing when you think of payroll, workforce management, talent acquisition, benefits. It runs the entire gamut of some of the most important, sensitive, but complex data that an organization generates. And I think what the Ceridian executive was really trying to do was, how do they best unlock that data on behalf of the customer? And I think that was the genesis for why a chief data officer and why now. So thankfully, through some, I'll call them friends of Ceridian, I found my way there and they found their way to me. And what was compelling for me was the richness of the data.
Right.
And the fact that we could do so much for that to really drive quantifiable value for Ceridian's customers. And so with all that, my background with that in unstructured data, in dealing with intelligence, machine learning, and things of that nature, I've been blessed to work with many smart people. It was a great role from heaven that fit very well.
It sounds like Ceridian really is rallying behind data and really, gets the concept of data driven, right? So
Yes.
so before we get into how we got to this point where everyone is just drowning, I guess you could say, in the volumes of data, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how we got here in the first place. Like, I understand it's the sheer volume itself is a factor, right? We're just producing mounds and mounds of it, but it can't just be the volume of data that we're struggling, the reason for why we're struggling at the moment, or is it?
I think part of it is, you talked about at the very beginning the why. Why does your organization exist? What is your real purpose? And I think we are so inundated with so many aspects of data in our daily lives. You think of your consumer life, you think of all the things that we're dealing with on an ongoing basis. And then I look at it from a standpoint of business systems within massive enterprise organizations that we support. And it is just a flood of information coming at people. And I would argue we're not discerning. We actually don't know what to do with this volume. We don't actually understand maybe the right questions to ask. And that's why it comes back to the more or less that why does your organization exist, to try to get at some of the root cause of where data can make the biggest impact. That will lead you somewhat to the course of which data you should be looking at and curating and leveraging.
Do you think that's also one of the reasons why today we're having issues around data governance? We're having, a lot of conversations around the importance of data governance is because we haven't had the conversations around the why yet?
I think it's part of it. I think it's also an organization's realization. If you look at the recent rulings in the EU and you look at data privacy laws in California and now popping up state by state in the US, I think there's two things that are coming together. There's this incredible richness of data. And at the same time, many organizations haven't really decided on what's appropriate with this data. Where should we be using it? Where can we be using it? We were joking around pre-call about concerns, and we won't get into the politicization of vaccines, but people are worried about being tracked. And the answer was, wow, you're worried about being tracked? Let's go back 10 or 15 years with your initial smartphone, and let's talk about all the data organizations have driven around you that you have zero control over. And I think those organizations that are astute about that and want to be seen as great stewards, trustworthy as it relates to that, they've recognized that both with all this data comes great responsibility. So they've started looking at both ends of that spectrum. How do we use it and utilize it on behalf and for the benefit of our customers and perhaps our businesses? And then how do we protect that data in a way that gives our customers confidence?
Right. I was talking earlier to the SVP of IT at Holt Renfrew, and she was also saying we were having similar conversations, and she was referencing that the different data sources was also another challenge for them, right? Especially from a retail perspective, if you think of just social media and all the different platforms that a customer needs that usually goes to. So I'm sure that must add a layer of complexity as well to not only producing it, but also wrangling it and trying to house it, so to speak.
No, it's a great point. Previous company to Ceridian, we were in the employee advocacy and social media space. So part of the challenge is how do you take the data and how do you drive a level of quality from all these different sources? Because one of the biggest challenges for many organizations, going back to the earlier conversation, is your data can be fairly dirty. It needs to go through a transformation. It needs to have a sense of quality around it, and then figuring out how all this different data needs to then come together. In Holt Renfrew's case, I mean, maybe they're looking at sentiment analysis out of Twitter or other places as one aspect of trying to bring that together with your POS data and other areas. So, but you still need to create a consistency in the quality in that data before it has value.
And we haven't even, broached the subject of AI and predictive behaviors as a result of your data too, right? So that's a whole other layer of complexity around that. So you talked about it at the beginning about your why. So walk me through what you think, organizations need to start asking themselves, all right, obviously it's the why, but break that down for me a little bit. And what do you think? What does that entail?
I think first off, you fundamentally have to come to the question of what data is important. And look, we can talk about revenue, you can talk about that net income, you can talk about NPS scores. There's tons of ways to measure it. But we have to become, I think, more data first in the way that we think about things and ask ourselves, it's not the 100 different things or attributes of data that you could measure. What are the top three or four?
Mhm.
One of the things I find is that it's almost become overwhelming for most organizations because they're trying to eat the elephant in one bite. And they can't do that. The volume of the fire hose that's coming at them for data doesn't allow for that. So they have to be discerning. And I think we're so busy in our day-to-day lives and our business lives that I'm not sure that we're stepping back and asking ourselves, what are the 4 or 5 things that we would love to know about our business? It's going to be different from a retailer, for a tech company like ourselves, or things of that nature. And then ask yourself, why are those things important? What's the root benefit of it? And then do we actually capture, to your point, the data that actually is going to matter in answering those questions? And I think that's the starting point. There's a lot of FOMO around artificial intelligence, machine learning, and things of that nature. From my experience, let's just say a lot of people talk the game, but they don't play the game. And so I wouldn't worry about fear of missing out. When we look at our strategy for our clients of inform, predict, and act, many of our clients are still at that informed stage. They still don't have necessarily the data they want to make great informed decisions. Forget about prediction, which is looking at what the future is or how you automatically act on it. Just the data they need to run their business in a consolidated, regular format that they can use. And that to me is a starting point. People need to start smaller and they really need to understand why the data is important. And do we have a quality sense of where we can get that data?
And I think what also the benefits do you think of starting small is you get quick wins, right? And you get quick wins, you demonstrate back to the business that you're using the data so that you kind of grow and you amplify each time you iterate on whatever project you're doing so you can get that adoption across the organization. And I mention this because do you find that, when you go back to answering your why, you have to look at, does the answer of why vary depending on area of the business that you're in? So marketing needs data for X and finance needs data for Y and so on and so forth. So how do you reconcile all the different needs across an organization? Because then you got to get that alignment, right? Because otherwise you're kind of in circles, turning in circles.
There's where a chief data officer comes in, I guess, or something like that. I think we all have to have an aspect. I think, you look at the skills economy, you look where it's all going. I think there's an aspect of almost every role eventually that has a data aspect to it, where we should be data forward in our thinking and how we would use that, how we would leverage that. So I think that's one part of it. And you're quite right. Every part of the organization, I mean, finance may be looking at a set of metrics. Well, first of all, let's talk about it. Most organizations have a scorecard and they're looking at general metrics across the organization. That makes sense. But that, to your point, boils down by different part of the organization. I mean, your HR group may be incredibly worried about attrition, voluntary turnover rate, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So those are metrics that they really care about. Are we hiring or recruiting in a diverse way? Are we promoting in a diverse way? And because that has a real impact for many public companies on their outcome as it relates to revenue. You have another part of the organization that might be your customer service area, and they care about what's the first time to resolution, what's the average time that we're spending. So each one's going to have unique aspects to it. The goal then is to get somebody or a group, usually the IT organization, to help, for lack of a better term, wrangle that together. But it is up to each individual part of the organization to think in data terms, not in bits and bytes. But what's the key question? Why do you want to answer that question? Right. And if you can get to that, that's the right starting point. And maybe you each only get 1 or 2 attributes to start with, and then it goes from there. But you made one point that's really important there, which is start small. Because one of the things I will tell you, especially as organizations move from inform to predict and act, you will fail a lot if you're really taking the right risks in trying to use data effectively in machine learning applications or in general intelligence applications or in automation applications. Not everything is a shoot and score from a Canadian context. Not everything puts a puck in the back of the net.
Right.
In fact, you need an executive that understands that you are going to fail. And the objective is to fail fast with this data and then move on. So I think that's a core
Right.
thing to keep in mind.
Well, data management is not the responsibility of a single department, right? It's the responsibility across the entire suite, so to speak, and across the company. So you had alluded to early, just a few seconds ago, about, I guess that's the role of the CDO. So let's talk about your role as a CDO in terms of it. It is relatively new, right? In terms of legacy wise. And I'm curious to hear, what are you observing in terms of, are you observing any challenges in terms of the organization understanding your role, where it starts, stops? Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's fairly complex right now, not
Mhm.
specifically just in the CDO role, but in what an organization has to consider. So, the first thing you talked about right off the bat, right, is governance. But even before governance, it's data consent and data rights. All these different things come into
Right.
play. So, to me, part of the thing for the role of a chief data officer or even the CIO acting initially in that vein is that you have to really partner carefully with the organization. Now, as a tech company with thousands and thousands of customers, we look different than, let's say, a Holt Renfrew or somebody else. But there's how you collect and get data and use data. So there's a data consent part that for us has a tight relationship with not only our product organization, but our legal organization, as well as our customer, importantly from a data consent and data privacy point of view. So that's one aspect of it.
Mhm.
Then the data governance. Now you've got this wonderful treasure trove of data that everyone says, yeah, more or less we're consented, we're good, and you're going to use it on behalf of the customer to drive value for them. But now you have to make sure that you've put the right process in place from a true data governance point of view, outside just the data acquisition, to go, how are we managing this? How are we managing marketing's asking for X data from the organization? Should they have it? And you have to look at that whole aspect of how data is governed and used within the organization. What's the lineage of that data? How do you track who's asking for it? When, for example, should that data even be removed? Like, you asked for it, we gave it to you for 2 months, you're done with it. We need to make sure it's effectively removed, whether it's got PII data or not. Those kind of considerations have to be there.
Mhm.
Then it just moves on from there. It's how are you leveraging the data? If I look at ourselves from a machine learning or intelligence point of view, how are you building models? How are you looking at the trustworthiness of those models? What kind of data are you bringing in? What kind of data are you testing with separately than you may be training with? What kind of insights are you trying to mine out if we make it a little simpler than using a machine learning model? What kind of things do you want to surface to the business? What's important? So all these aspects I find right now fall in an umbrella under the CDO role. But even
Mhm.
ourselves, we have leaders in data science, we have leaders in data algorithmics and other areas that report up to the CDO that help balance out that need.
So, just listening to you, a thought entered into my mind. It's also about behavior and change management and right. Back in my ERP days, whenever we used to implement ERP, change management was the number one things we had to address. And I don't think it's different today as it relates to around data. And my observation of Ceridian and my knowledge of it, it seems to be a very data-driven organization, right? And based on my conversations with you.
Yeah.
So what advice would you have for an organization who's struggling on, as they say, wrangling their data? We'll have to that's another podcast, just figuring out where wrangling came from. But what advice would you have for them to help them structure that and get to an end goal, which is a data-driven culture?
It starts with making sure that the people that you're hiring nowadays have a focus on actually understanding or utilizing data. And I think that's one aspect of it. There was an interesting podcast actually that we did, but a panel we did for one of our Disruptor series internally at Ceridian, where I brought 3 individuals from outside in the venture community who were founding AI companies, much like organizations like yourself. And that was an interesting question because you hear a lot of people saying everyone should be a data scientist. We should democratize that. There should be, we should liberate everybody. And the answer is, from this one individual who I really respect, No, no. Everybody can't think like a data scientist. They don't have the math background. They don't have many things that would make or what makes a data scientist truly excellent at what they do. But the
Mm,
curiosity about data, that's what I would look for when I'm hiring. Is that person, especially depending on the role, is that person curious about how this data gets used, how it comes together, how it can be used in the future? So I think how I would look at it is even spinning it consumer wise when I'm talking to an individual and saying, how do you think data plays into your consumer life? And with all the different apps we use, from Instagram to if it's FB or Twitter, or how Amazon is looking at your shopping patterns or Netflix is recommending it to you. So it's seeing whether or not they think in those terms, whether
right.
they don't have to be a data scientist, but are they data curious? So that's the very first step. Find those people that are within your organization in those different groups that way, and start there and look for hiring in that from that perspective in a data curious person, I guess. That would be my starting point. But a lot of it too is sitting down with the organization and prioritizing what data is of value. To Holt Renfrew, I know there's corporate data, and I keep coming back to them, but like their POS data, the data they may have on their customer relationship management systems and things like that. Does the organization have a good catalog of all the data sources that are available to them? And then again, it comes back to the type of questions they want to ask. And then they can triangulate those three things. You get someone who's really maybe brilliant on the customer insight side that just knows how customers think. You couple that up with someone who really understands your CRM system, your point of sale systems, and then you bring those three people together and you start talking about the art of the possible in terms of
Mm-hmm.
where or how you might want to enable that data. It starts as simply as that.
Interesting. I agree with that 100%. And I had a conversation with another CIO the other day, and we were talking about soft skills, right? And the soft skills of the future data leaders, and the importance of things like creative thinking and organizational, being able to bring an organization together. I like to call them as power skills personally, but how much does that weigh into it in terms of future data leaders? What do you think about, what are your thoughts on that?
That's an interesting question. I don't know if I've specifically spent a lot of time on it. I know that you have to be, for lack of a better term, networked in the organization. That's a
Yeah.
given. Like our working relationship with our legal team is one of the closest ones we have, because in fairness, we're dealing with our clients sense the PII. We want to make sure that everything we're doing is trustworthy and ethical, and that we're looking at it the right way through the customer lens when we use it. So legal is a great partner. And then for us as a technology company, there's all our product side of the business where we want to infuse data in every decision. And I think that to me is a key opportunity for us. So we spend time with our heads of product. We spend time with our different product
Mm-hmm.
leaders to talk about, again, what we do is an outreach almost as the art of the possible. Have you thought about how you could have a recommender engine for your benefits plan that could do X, Y, and Z and help them understand what's possible? Thankfully, we have great product leaders that do think in that kind of data infused way, but we do a lot of outreach into the organization with the business
Mm-hmm.
to talk about, have you thought about this? What if when you're automatically, I'll take an example from our standpoint, what if you're automatically running a payroll and in real time we could actually find that there was a problem in it and notify you automatically before the payroll is even completed? Because for us, we do continuous payrolls. What's the value of that? Is that quantifiable value to you? And if we can solve that problem and let you know, does that provide value? So it's business questions. It's not technical questions. Eventually, there's a hell of a lot of technology, excuse
Yeah.
my French, that comes into it. But arguably, it's the business question up front, which is where I find the opportunity for me of both technical and business to kind of dig into that. So
Mm.
we are an outbound consultant to an organization as well. We build a lot of data products internally in our group that we externalize to customers and to our internal customers.
Right. I really love the art of possible. I think that's 100%. That's absolutely it. And also I don't think we hear it very often, the words legal and partner in the same sentence very
We
often,
have a
but it's
great
true.
group to deal with, and their knowledge of data privacy and
It's,
everything on a worldwide basis is incredible.
I agree.
Ignorance doesn't rule the day anymore with data, and we're in a global environment where so many of our businesses, even the smallest startup of 20 or 30 people, could be selling into the EU, Australia, Asia
Yeah,
Pac. Most businesses are global businesses. We are borderless at the end of the day when
yeah.
you think about that.
Absolutely. Well, I know they're a great partner from a marketing standpoint, right? Just because of the data privacy on right
Yep.
GDPR and compliance. I want to dig in just a little bit into, you mentioned this a couple of times, your model, which is inform, predict, act. I think
Yep.
that's a really great, perfect words to describe. So I was wondering, can you just share a little bit with us what that is and what was the genesis of that model?
Wow, I'm not even sure. I'm not a beer drinker, so it's not IPA because I'm a beer drinker. I couldn't come up with a decent acronym for wine. So that's a bit of a challenge. But it really goes back to how I've looked at all the businesses that I've been part of, right? I mean, the first step for any organization is to be informed. And arguably, that's where you have reporting, you have maybe very rich data and dashboards, measurements, and things of that
Yeah.
nature. And the argument I would make is that in Inform, it's the individual that's pursuing the data all the time. I have to go find the data. It may be there, it may be packaged for me, but I have to set in the back of my mind, hey, I need to look at that attrition rate, or I need to look at whether or not my payroll costs are running accordingly, or that all the shifts I need for next week are properly scheduled. So that's me chasing data, and that's the
Hmm.
Inform part. And then when I think of predict, that's where you start flipping the funnel a bit. For predict, that's me saying, hey, it's really important to me to understand that where our same day sales are in line with where we expect, or that we're scheduling within, 95 to 105% of optimum scheduling. And if we go outside that, I need to know about it. That's the switch where in predict, how we look at that is data begins to find the individual.
Hmm.
So I'm lazy inherently.
Yeah.
So if I can tell a system like our system that, hey, if our attrition gets over 7%, I want to know that. And the system, using techniques like linear regression, if you're doing things like that, or other techniques, can predict into the future that it looks like I'm going to actually track to 9%. Come and tell me. Don't let me have to go chase it. And that's where we go from inform to predict. Now, the only downside to predict is the data is finding me, and it's actually giving me some insight into what it thinks is going to happen next, whether we're using simple regression, whether we're using machine learning models to predict these things. The next step to me is act, which is, how do I take advantage of now this early indicator to do something meaningful to change that course of action? And for ACT, this is a lot of finding the anomalies. It's the things that are happening within your data that you may not be thinking about, but you are the right places for you to look. So I'll use an example for attrition because it's hitting all of us so much with
Mm.
turnover. It's one thing to know that, hey, my attrition, I ran a report, my attrition's running high, it's going to be about 7%. It's another thing to say, tell me if it looks like it's going to trend over 8 or 9%. Let me set a threshold or a range. But now when it comes back to me and says, it looks like you're going to trend over 9%. And by the way, the eastern region in your finance department seems to be tracking the highest. Those are the anomalous points in the data that you should look at, might be the right insight. And for example, if I'm a financial services customer out of US, I know that there's a lot of finance positions available in the southern US where a lot of the finance companies are. So it may not be surprising that that's happening there, but then that leads me to know where to look versus just when to look. And so that's why we look at inform, predict, and act. And it allows us to also apply our technology lens to that to help
Okay.
the customers through that. As I said, most customers, everyone wants to talk about, all the fancy stuff and things related to that. But the truth of the matter is most customers are still trying to get to the proper informed stage to ask the right questions and at least have the right data that they can go after. But it's good to have this kind of capability maturity model, or this maturity model of where to go next steps as you're checking the box. Okay, inform, we're doing well. Now, what do we want to start predicting? If we can know it early, what changes
Mhm.
our business, drives our quantifiable value, things like that. So that's how that came together. I wish I could tell a romantic story about why IPA, but it's really just the order of operations in my geeky sequential brain that thinks of things in that way. Plus, it's easy to remember, I guess.
It is. Well, I remembered it.
There you go. Perfect.
And trust me, I have no memory. Data has the ability to create immense value, right? But it's also a source of great risk. Actually, reminds me of the Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility.
Responsibility, yes. Great line.
Right. So what are some of the things that organizations can do today to minimize that risk? Just right off the top of your head, what do you think those are?
First off is the lineage and the quality of the data. So before we get into all the fancy stuff, if you don't know where it came from and you can't trace it back, that's your first problem. So you need to know what's the source of that data. You need to understand that lineage. The next step of that is, what is the quality of that data? Is it accurate? Does it represent data that's been modified in some way, shape, or form? So there's that aspect of it. And then there's the transformation of it, putting it into a format or augmenting it in a way that provides better value to the organization. So those are some of the first steps before you talk about whether or not you're just pushing that data out through a dashboard, or you're starting to ingest that data to build models or simple algorithms even that are making decisions for you.
Right.
So you have to really understand that, because the next step from that is, to me, the part where, for most organizations, when I say it's the scarier part, it's the part that has a lot of inherent risk. And at the same time, if it's done properly in the right ways, you get great outcomes from it and you minimize that risk. And that is when you're starting to use the data for decision-making, algorithmics, machine learning, and general intelligence. And I say that because you're seeing a lot of jurisdictions like the EU in the end of July with their 100-page document that really talks about how they're looking at the application of even what I would call simple intelligence, which is how our general decision tree is working inside your software, making sure that you're uncovering that so it's explainable. That's where it starts getting interesting.
Yeah, I feel like we've just scratched the surface in terms of topics with you, but I'm afraid it looks like we're come to the end of our time here.
Wow.
I know. Listen,
Time goes fast.
It was. Thank you very much for joining us today, and hopefully we'll see you again.
I look forward to it. I always love talking about data, and there's so much more out there to talk about.
You bet.
Thank you for checking out this episode of Data Driven Leaders. This show is brought to you by Gen Squared, an organization dedicated to solving data and analytics challenges for the modern enterprise. If you enjoyed what you learned in this episode, make sure to follow Data Driven Leaders wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, or visit gensquare.com to get immediate access to all of the latest episodes.